All right. Make sure we're good to go. I think so. All right. Happy Earth Day, everyone. It is April 22nd, 2021. I'm glad to see you all here today. Hopefully you can see me. I realized that the functions changed. Okay, I think we're all good to go. My name's Brett Nackman with College Autism Network. Glad to see so many of you returning. I believe we may have a few new folks to the call, so welcome aboard. Canvas is your home for sharing resources and news and materials as it pertains to autism and post-secondary education. Friendly reminder to folks to please add your name to the meeting agenda, which I'll post again in the chat for you to access, and to highlight your name just to make sure that we have your information curated. Also to reminder to please mute your microphones. But we want to encourage your participation, of course, through the chat, certainly through, if you have something that you'd like to share verbally to the whole group, we'll have time for engagement in just a couple of minutes. But I think we're ready to go. As a reminder to folks too, you can join our listserv. That's how you'll hear about forthcoming meetings and notes from our meetings, as well as video recordings and presentations from our featured presenters. So we know most of you are already on that, but for those of you who maybe this is your first time, we'd encourage you to check that out, and that is in our meeting agenda. Now, and I guess I should also say one of our main highlights for today, of course, is our guest presentation from our colleagues at University of Delaware in the Spectrum Scholars Program. We have Dr. Jess Monahan and Dr. Brian Freedman, who will be delivering a presentation in just a few minutes. At the beginning of our Canvas meetings, as we've been trying to do, is encourage more of a discussion where folks do share news and resources and tools that could be helpful for folks in our community. You can see in the chat, there's a section called, I should say in our meeting agenda, not our chat. In our meeting agenda, we have a section called Share a Resource. So you can add a link or an example of a tool within that directly. Otherwise, you can put it in the chat and we'll catalog that and we'll put all of that in the meeting notes for everybody. So I'd encourage you to use this time toward putting things in there or thinking about things you'd like to share. One thing that I'd like to start off with, and then I'll turn the floor over to anybody else who'd like to share tidbits or tools, is that actually and it's just very fortuitous timing, our presenters today, as well as other members of our Canvas community, recently published a journal article on the impacts of COVID-19 on autistic college students. It was just published several weeks ago. Really fascinating stuff, really good sample too. I think 76 participants. These are autistic college students across the United States, and talking about how COVID has shaped their lives and ability to access supports and resources to enable their success. Really rich stuff in there, and it is easily accessible for most anyone. So I would highly encourage you all to check it out. I found it very useful, and I'll look forward to citing it in some of my future work. And I imagine that there will be some really easy to implement insights from the article as well. Turn it over to whoever else would like to participate at this juncture.
Do we agree about the learning disability?
Can I go, Brett?
Yeah, go ahead, Lee.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to actually share my screen, which means I'm going to stop Jess and Brian sharing their screen, but just for a moment, because I want to show you a really exciting tool that we have launched. Can you all see that Autism Career Empowerment on your screen? Brett?
Yeah, Lee, I think it's showing, I don't know for other folks, for me it's showing at the top of my screen in a small window. Let me try something. Hang on one sec, Lee. I think folks should now be able to see it.
Okay, all right, great. So ACE, Autism Career Empowerment, is an online curriculum that is designed for people who do career services work with autistic students, but aren't necessarily very experienced working with people with autism. And so we've put this together with a great team from Vanderbilt University, and it's free of charge. Anybody can use it. What you do is you just register, and it opens up a course, the ACE course, and I'll just give you a sense of what that looks like, the ACE curriculum. It's got a series of modules that a person just works their way through, and these modules might take anywhere from like 10 to 15 minutes, basic information, but also career-specific information. And when you're done, you've really learned a lot about supporting students with autism. So, as I said, no charge at all, and I will drop the link to this in the chat, and we're really interested in your feedback. We hope this is the first of a series of online topics, and we hope that you all find it useful.
Thank you, Lee.
So I'll also take a moment. I dropped in there another article that also came out of this group. I can't remember if we shared it before, and I clearly don't mind a little self-service plug here. But it's part of a plug really for Brett, because in addition to being the lead author on that article, on a product that came out of some work that began as part of this very group in Canvas, Brett recently announced, so I don't feel bad saying it either, that he has, upon completing his degree at Wisconsin, is going to be working as a research fellow and postdoctoral researcher at North Carolina State University, working with their community college research center. I'm going to get all the names wrong, Brett, and community or technical education group as well. So tell them all the acronyms, all the letters. But I just wanted to let you all know that Brett has been the driving force behind this group for several years, all while being a doc student. Anyway, I'm really proud. I know that he's made a great contribution here, and I'll let him share more.
Thanks, Brad. I'll keep it brief. Yes, I'm going to be moving to Raleigh. So if anybody has insight into life in North Carolina, I'll welcome your insights. And yes, I'm going to be working for a community college research center, which is wonderful because that's a big area of my work. And yes, and some of my work will also continue to be on disabled college students, and a project I'll be working on is related to disabled students in career and technical education, post-secondary CTE. So yeah, very excited about it. Thanks, Brad. Other resources or news folks have to share?
I did want to share one other article that I came across very recently. I will put it in the chat as well, or yeah, I guess I'll put that in the chat as well. To be honest, I haven't read it yet, but I just downloaded it, and perhaps others will be able to. But Autism in Adulthood just put it out. One of the things that we have seen many of programs and interventions that draw from peer mentoring. And while it's been happening a lot, there's not a ton of empirical literature to really determine whether it works, whether it does any good. So this article by Dirksen et al. is an effort to kind of synthesize what is known about peer mentorship programs. So I'll give it a read, and if you all have, actually, if anybody has, could you give us a quick rundown? What does it say? What do we find? And if not, I'll expect a report next time.
I'll just mention the College Autism Summit is a mere 6 months away. But perhaps more important for this group, the call for proposals will be live June 1st. So we'll be sending out emails and putting in our mailing in our newsletter. If you are not in, if you're not on our mailing list, if you're new to this group, or you're not sure if you're on a mailing list, drop your email in the chat, and I will make sure you're on that list. But June 1st for call for proposals, and October 26th to 29th is the summit.
Great, thank you, Lee and Brad. I also want to note that Jess has posted an article in the chat as well. And again, I know it's a lot of material to look at in the chat. I'll make sure to compile that so it's easily accessible for everybody. And any other thoughts or resources or news, folks? Realize there's about 40 of us on this call, so I'm sure there's no shortage of things, but I want to be mindful of that. Okay, well, if you have anything you'd like to drop into the chat later or share at a later point, feel free to do so. And apologies if I had to mute you in the past couple of minutes. There was some feedback on our end, so we want to make sure that the audio was crisp for everyone. At this point, I'm going to turn it, I think we've covered everything. Thank you for the notes in the chat, by the way. We're going to turn it over to our presenters for today. So Dr. Jess Monahan and Dr. Brian Freedman, as I mentioned, from the University of Delaware, are going to talk about social skills interventions for young adults fitting into a neurotypical world, ? Both Brian and Jess have been active members of our Canvas community for quite a while, so really glad to have them on. We'll have about, let me look at the time, we have about 25 to 30 minutes for their remarks, and then the remaining time will be Q&A, so please feel free to put your thoughts and questions in the chat, and I'm sure they'll address them at that juncture. So turn it over to you, Jess and Brian.
Thanks. So we have a lot of slides. We're going to skip through some of them just to kind of keep our presentation short so we can talk after, but we'll send them to Brett so that everybody has access to them. I also have an 8-year-old second grader working from home, doing school from home, whose special interest is himself, and he likes it when he sees himself on camera. So you may see him pop through. So I don't think I need to do this here, but we just always like anytime we present to let you know that we are going to be using person and identity first language throughout, just kind of respecting everybody's preferences across both ideologies. I will likely lean identity first, but we will try and make an effort to use both. So we also like to start with introductions and transparency statements. I'm Jess Monahan. I am the research manager at Spectrum Scholars, which Brian will tell you a little bit more about when he introduces himself and gets into everything. I'm also an assistant professor at the School of Education at UD. I also am an adjunct at the University of Connecticut teaching special education law. And my research focuses on young adults with autism, with a specific focus on bringing in autistic voice, specifically related to social relationships and mental health. And so I'll do the transparency statement now just because it's mostly about me. I just like to tell everybody I have ADHD and anxiety. That's a huge part of who I am. You will likely see a lot of it kind of come out here. You may see typos. I've looked at it 17 times. It's probably still going to happen. I also have a son who is on the autism spectrum. Doug, can you turn that down a little bit, babe? Thank you. And just so you know, the discussion and recommendations part of this paper were developed in conjunction with an autistic alum who is from UD, who is an author on the paper, which was we just received and accept with minor revisions for the Review Journal of Autism and Developmental Disabilities like 2 days ago. So I took some of their feedback and revamped some of the slides too. So you should be seeing that soon. Brian, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much for having us, everybody. And Brett, thanks as always for leading these discussions. As Jeff mentioned, she and I are both at the Center for Disability Studies at the University of Delaware, which is one of the University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, UCEDS. All of you have UCEDS, at least one in your state. We function as a network. Within CDS, we have several post-secondary transition programs, including Spectrum Scholars, which I'll tell you about in a moment, and an inclusive higher ed program for students with intellectual disabilities. I'm also the co-director of a leadership program for autistic people and others with disabilities, family members, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows. And Jess and I together make up a unit that really enjoys leading innovative programs and research supporting transition age youth. As I mentioned before we jump into some background, Jess and I are both connected with the Spectrum Scholars program. I put a link to the program in the chat box. Spectrum Scholars is a college to career initiative at the University of Delaware for undergraduate autistic students. The program itself and the research that we're talking about today and the research that's conducted in the context of the program is all actually sponsored through a grant from JPMorgan Chase and Company. Within Spectrum Scholars, we utilize a multi-tiered system of support to provide a wide range of supports and services to students who identify as being autistic across campus, as well as other students who identify as neurodivergent. This comes in the form of one-on-one supports, group-based supports, and other trainings that we do, not just with the students, but also across the campus community in our, as we are determined to create a more inclusive campus community as well as surrounding community within Delaware. So, so for some background on our study, and many in this group are probably already aware, social networks in general, and in particular for autistic people, are important for perceived social support. And we know that social connectedness, no matter who you are, is often positively correlated with well-being. No matter what types of social relationships you like to build with others, we know that social connectedness can be quite important, no matter what it looks like, no matter who it is that you're connecting with. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking and looking at others' work on how can we support autistic adults, including college students who are on the autism spectrum, in getting these social networks and building these connections. So my background's in clinical psychology, and so I come from a more traditional background in the way of my connection to the autism community and autism research from a professional side. And so, of course, historically, professionals have turned to social skill interventions as the way that we want to, that we think I'll speak on as a person who identifies as neurotypical, how we think autistic people can best connect with others. Of course, over time, we've learned more and more about social skill interventions and have learned that while we neurotypicals may think that they are effective, that they're not necessarily always effective. Next slide. So as you look at some of the social skills intervention reviews that exist, that look at the wide range of research examining interventions designed to support autistic people in building social relationships, they do range widely. Some focus on kids. There are, as identified here, several that look at social skill interventions for adults. We were particularly interested in the degree that autistic people were able to provide input and feedback on what those interventions look like and the sorts of outcomes that they were, that the developers were looking to achieve, in consideration of the fact that autistic people should be given the opportunity to not only have a say in the kinds of interventions, but ensure that they're in alignment with the values and outcomes that they're looking to get out of them. Next slide. Now, I know that this group doesn't need to probably hear about why do we need the autistic voice, but it was important to us, especially in the context of the manuscript that Jess just talked about, to talk about why this is so important. We know, everybody on this call, I'm sure, knows about the disparity between what we've been studying in autism research for decades and what the autistic community is saying that they need in terms of research and how we go about developing and examining interventions. And we also know that when autistic people aren't involved in the development of interventions, often because that leads to those interventions not being aligned with the values and outcomes that they're looking to achieve, or perhaps even do some detriment, naturally they're less satisfied with the findings and recommendations. And frankly, when we talk about translation into the world of practice, are going to be less inclined to seek out those sorts of supports. So there has been a recent call to action that's included autistic voices at all levels of research, and it's been a wonderful thing to be a part of and to hear about. And it's really been led by the cry of nothing about us without us. And nothing about us without us, of course, stemmed from the larger disability community, who looked at policies and processes that were being developed without any input from them. And research in the autism community certainly falls into that category as well, as not often having an autistic voice incorporated or perhaps leading it, but certainly needing that. So we're grateful that groups like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network have been formed and are helping to sort of lead this new charge. Next slide. We know that incorporating autistic voices is particularly important for social skills because, fortunately, there's been more and more research that is shining a light on the real damage that can be done when autistic people are feeling forced to spend so much time camouflaging and masking in order to adjust to living in a neurotypical world. We know that camouflaging and masking is quite common, and it's done to avoid things like bullying, but it's also correlated with increased anxiety and depression and even suicidal ideation. Unfortunately, a lot of social skill interventions in particular encourage masking because what gets communicated through those interventions is that there is a right way or correct way to function, which is really imposing neurotypical rules of socializing onto autistic people. Next slide. So here are the research questions. I'm not going to read all of them. As just mentioned, we can we're going to share the slides with you, and we'll certainly also share the article since it seems on track to be published, which is really good news. But in summary, we wanted to look at the degree that the literature has addressed social skills interventions, and to what extent these interventions were informed by autistic input, and that researchers are collecting information and considering the outcome variables that are most desired by autistic people. Next slide. Up front, we wanted to share with you the limitations because we feel like that's something important to consider whenever you're thinking about research. So in this case, this was this did function as a systematic literature review, and we only looked at peer-reviewed articles. So we know there's a growing amount of research that's done that's not necessarily peer-reviewed. This work also only includes research that was done in the United States. That's not to disparage research that's done in other countries. It was just a way to limit the kind of research that was happening, to limit the search itself. And we comment on the kind of input that is given by autistic people based on what we know through statements that are made or lack of statements made within the articles that we were reviewing. So it may have been that there were people who identify as autistic or neurodivergent who were authors on some of these different works. However, because they didn't self-disclose, we just made we made assumptions based on a lack of statement about that. And finally, similarly, some interventions may have involved autistic input, but if there was no discussion about it, the study wasn't included. So our hope with our article is that there would be a push, as Jess mentioned earlier, to be open about these things up front so that others are aware of it. Next slide.
And one thing I just want to add, Brian, is that the reason that one of the reasons we chose to only do the US is because we knew we wanted to focus on like social norms, and that can vary widely based on your culture. So the US was one of the things we chose to do. All right, so I'm going to fly through this stuff because you have it, and if you have questions about like the specifics about methods, I can completely answer those after. We're pretty transparent about it, but essentially we did a systematic lit review. You can see our Boolean string. Our criteria was 1990 or after because of the adoption of ADA. And English, again, domestic, peer reviewed. And this search happened in the spring of 2020, which is another, I guess, limitation of lit reviews, especially in our field. Things are coming out so quickly that it's possible things were published after. This is our kind of flow chart of everything that the steps that we went through. We started with 505 abstracts, and then we ended up actually analyzing 26. So again, I can answer any questions about this, but in the interest of time, we're going to get to the good stuff. Here are our coding categories, the category we coded for, and then the options or the inclusion criteria. There were 2 of us, and we did calculate inter-rater reliability on everything that we did, lots of conferencing to make sure that we were on the same page about things. And so here we go. 26 articles found in 14 journals. They ranged from 1990 to 2020. Only 1 qualitative, 19 quantitative, 7 of those single subject, 6 quasi, and 6 randomized control trials, which I actually thought was pretty high for kind of where the state of everything is, to have 6 RCTs already. And so 6 mixed method studies. In terms of participants, there were 342 included across all the studies. One of the studies did not report on demographics. So when you look, especially in the paper, and see the different demographic breakdowns, those are based on not the full sample of all of the papers because I didn't have demographics, but we had sample sizes ranging from 2 to 49. Every study except for 1 required an autism diagnosis, which we wanted to code for that, especially because as we're doing our research and trying to think about inclusivity with young adults and barriers to diagnosis, we're always like, what do we do? Do we require it or not? And so we just wanted to kind of see what people were doing in these studies. 6 reported co-occurring disabilities, 8 were specific to college students, and you can see that the sample was heavily white male. There were no reports of transgender, non-binary, or other, and so I'll talk about that a little bit in the discussion, but it's important to highlight. So there were 17 studies that looked at small group interventions and 9 that looked at one-on-one interventions, and the numbers worked out this way. It was so annoying because there were also 17 studies that looked at only social skills and 9 studies that looked at broader topics that included social skills. Those are not correlated with each other. So it wasn't that all the small groups did social skills only. They just happened to be the same number. But those other topics were things like employment, interview, that kind of stuff, but they were specifically giving instruction on social skills. All right, so when we actually think about autistic input in the creation of or satisfaction of the intervention, 11 studies looked at autistic perspectives. So that meant after the fact, were they satisfied with the intervention? Did they find benefit from the intervention? Would they recommend it to others? Those types of things. And what we found were high levels of satisfaction and positive experiences. The problem is that's less than half the studies even asked people about that. Only 3 actually included input in the development of the intervention. And so one study all the way back in 1999, our oldest study, actually got feedback after each weekly session and then incorporated that feedback into the next week's session. And then 2 studies had autistic individuals helping design the intervention before it was implemented. So in terms of outcome variables and measures, there was a lot of variability among the outcome variables, which is what is a common theme of other social skills lit reviews, it's always one of the things people say at the end is like, we don't really know what we could say because all of the variables were, you know, there's high variability with them. Lots of things we were seeing was rote memorization of social skill rules, social responsiveness. Mental health indicators were actually pretty popular in terms of outcome variables, which we were excited to see. Empathy. This list is not inclusive. There really were a lot. But these were kind of the most common ones. And then the different kinds of measurement tools to actually look at those outcome variables, we saw things like researcher created scales, interviews, observations, participant completed logs, and lots of normed assessments. So I'm going to briefly go through, like, I'm going to just tell you that we looked at the effectiveness of interventions and found mixed results of things. This is a nice little chart that we kind of, here's the variable, here are the studies, and here's the changes that we found. Overall, positive change, which is when you looked at any of those lit reviews, they're going to tell you overall, this is social skills interventions are working. But when you really get into the nitty gritty of those lit reviews and you look at what worked and what didn't work, there's a lot more variability than is discussed in the results and discussion section sometimes. Those are your single subject. Okay, because this is the good stuff. And I have a timer and we're at 6 minutes until 25 minutes. So I want to make sure that we focus on this stuff because this is like, this is what everybody gets jazzed about, right? So all of the studies were published over the last 20 years, with the exception of that one 1990 study, which is not surprising to any of us probably, right? We weren't really looking at young adults and adults we haven't been looking at that for very long. In terms of demographics, we were heavily white and heavily male. And this was fascinating to me. I think we coded for different genders or, you know, gender fluidity, and no studies reported it. And so it's possible that they just didn't report on those, right? But more likely, I think it's that no one was asking outside of male or female, because we know that this is a really common thing to have gender fluidity when you're autistic. It's really common. And so that was one of the things that was kind of like, man, why are we asking about this kind of stuff? So you'll see in our recommendations later that we're recommending that we are coding for that kind of demographic. Now, this is also interesting. Half of the studies examined causal relationships, and like lots of times I feel like that'd be like, yeah, go field. We're doing some really rigorous work. But it's possible that this is like a little bit premature if we don't have a really good grasp of what the autistic population identifies as our social needs, right? So if we have an RCT to show us that, like, okay, this intervention is going to allow you to know the rules of socializing. There Does the autistic community want that? We don't know. Like, you know, anecdotally, I can tell you, but there are some studies, we have very little evidence of what that actually needs to look like. But I don't want to discount the studies that are happening that look at social participation. So in terms of autistic input, the majority did not elicit any feedback. 25 studies were actually published after the creation of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network in 2007. And so it kind of highlights for us this lack of communication between people who are advocating and like raising the concerns and what we're doing as researchers. So, oh, you know, I didn't talk about this in the findings, Brian. So when we're thinking about measuring success, right, there was strength, I think, in the fact that there were a variety of measures and outcomes, observations, participant logs. There was a good variability there. But what we were not seeing, and again, a limitation would be that we haven't talked to these authors, we don't know, but they didn't report any autistic feedback in understanding what we should be measuring and getting a sense of like, what are the variables and outcomes that are important to you. The other piece that was concerning, and we go into this a lot more in the paper, language research really shows that it's not enough to like know the rules of socializing. Like, it's not enough for me to know that I need to be taking turns and not monopolize the conversation. it's more about those interactional and relational processes that are going to help people show authenticity in their social interactions, right? Because if I'm following rules that I've been taught, there's a great possibility that you kind of lose some of that authenticity in who you are. One thing that we didn't talk about in the findings that I'm like, oops, sorry, it's in the paper. Caregiver measures. So many of the studies relied on caregiver measures, specifically caregiver measures to show effectiveness. And so it's really, really important when we're looking at interventions to say, okay, like, cool, you show, you know, a positive outcome in this. Now, who measured that, right? And so, especially with college students, this is a severely under-researched area. I remember this coming up in a Canvas call a couple of months ago where we were talking about the family and autistic college student relationship and the lack of research. And so we need to talk to the autistic community, like, hey, when you're in college, are you okay? Like, does this feel okay to have like a parent or a caregiver, quote unquote, doing assessments? And so we have preliminary evidence that we're writing up right now that no, autistic college students don't want their parents involved in interventions. And so it's one study and it's just one finding of a larger study, but we just want to kind of put caution out there. I also recognize that there are not a lot of very good measures for autistic adults right now across a variety of variables. So it's a tricky situation to be in, but we really recommend kind of moving away from caregiver if possible.
I'll also note, I mean, there were a number of studies that also included outcome measures that were that included the autistic person's perspective. I mean,
yeah,
it's not like they were only looking at caregiver measures. So there was some latitude paid toward, you know, what the autistic person thought. But yeah, I think what was remarkable to Jess and I was in most other, I don't know of any other adult communities where we would go back and ask their parents what they thought about the intervention. But we're doing, that was what was done in many of these studies.
Right. All right, so we just hit 25 minutes. We're going to stretch it to the 30 if everyone's okay with that. So our big takeaway is this idea of reframing social skills instruction. And so when we think about this, like, I can't help but think about the double empathy problem and a lack of understanding about what, you know, okay, here's a neurotypical and this is how they show empathy and empathize. And here is someone who's autistic, who is highly empathetic, but just shows it differently. And there's this like disconnect, right? So much of the difficulties around social relationships come back to this disconnect. And even at the Autism at Work research workshop this week, we've been talking a lot about like disclosure and things at work and masking at work. And again, it's coming back to people not feeling comfortable enough to be themselves at work because of the other people around them not just being inclusive. So we are kind of throwing out there that we should be considering interventions that help students find meaningful relationships. And, you know, Dr. Holmes presented on one a couple months ago where my colleagues and I were like texting each other like crazy. We're like, we love this. So things like that are happening and it's really, really exciting. And so hopefully if we recreate this lit review in 10 years, we're gonna see way more autistic input, right? Like it's happening. The other thing that we are thinking about is how we can reframe social skills interventions so that they're kind of more of like an anthropological course in how neurotypical norms work, right? Like you want to fit into a neurotypical social environment. Here's what you're going to see. Here's what they're going to expect of you. Your choice if you're going to engage with that or not. So because you can't deny fact, I mean, especially going back to that conversation at Autism at Work research workshop, you cannot deny the fact that people need to understand how neurotypical norms work. We're just not there yet where everybody can just kind of be themselves. Because there's ramifications to that. And so we are trying to think, okay, how can we reframe this so it's less about like, here's what you should do and here's what's expected of you. And then, this is crazy. Also another thing that was coming up quite a bit at this conference this week, addressing the knowledge, beliefs, and actions of neurotypicals. So specifically at the Autism at Work research workshop, they were talking about inclusive leadership, trying to figure out how to make teams more inclusive so that neurotypicals can work to create environments where everybody including people who are neurodivergent, can feel comfortable in. Yes, right. So these are all, this is just kind of more citations to support the reason why we should be doing this. I actually have a friend who's autistic. He's in his mid-20s. We were talking last night. We hadn't talked in a couple of months. And he said, you know, I finally came to realize I just need to try and make friends with more autistic people, because being friends with neurotypicals is like way too hard. And so it was just one anecdotal thing. And I'm like, oh, he doesn't even know I'm writing a paper about this right now. But you were seeing that a lot. So figuring out ways that we can encourage relationship building with, you know, people who people are comfortable being friends with, and not trying to force people to be friends with groups that they're not comfortable with. And so, Brian, do you want to wrap it? I think this is our last slide. Let me make sure. Yes, this is our last slide. So do you want to take it away with this, Brian?
Sure. And Jess, feel free to jump in, especially around research. But when it comes to practical implications, you know, we're not suggesting that services and supports around building social relationships be discontinued. I mean, this remains really important for autistic people. However, we're suggesting that autistic people should be given the opportunity to share their thoughts on the kinds of interventions that we're delivering, and ask for input on these things. And also to frame, as we're thinking about how to deliver these interventions, framing them in the kind of context that Jess shared, so that it's not a judgment on what might be a natural instinct from someone who is autistic, but rather to help them to understand the world around them that includes a lot of neurotypical people and social norms. And so sometimes it's just a matter of framing it a particular type of way that we think could discourage what might come across as telling people that they should be camouflaging and masking. And actually also incorporating discussion about camouflaging and masking, and ensuring that people are getting supports around what the sorts of challenges that come along with having to do that. Jess, you want to share about research implications?
Yeah. So like I had said earlier, there are studies that are, you know, trying to understand what the autism community wants in terms of social participation. Sherry Fishbaugh and I at Westchester had just gotten IRB approval to do a qualitative study on this exact thing right before COVID hit. We could have continued and just moved remotely, but I mean, social participation in COVID means something very different now, right? So we put a pause on that, but we need more of that. There is some, we need more. Definitely recommending taking participatory action approaches whenever possible. Gathering input on measurements that are used in research. So like we have an advisory board and we're working on an anxiety intervention right now. And one of the things that we are asking our advisory board are like, hey, these are the things we think we want to measure to see if this intervention quote unquote worked. What do you think? And this is something I very much want to do. And I love measurement and development of measurements. So if anyone wants to work on this with me, just let me know. But we really need to develop and validate instruments that measure the impact of like social skills interventions that actually reflect the autistic community's needs, right? So once we know what we want, how can we measure if we're actually doing that or not in a reliable and valid way? Diversify participant samples. We all know that that's something we need to do, but that's also tied back to like our pool, which ties back to the fact that we just need to increase access for multiple people in higher education. And then the last recommendation that we highly, highly recommend, it's very common in qualitative research, kind of like a subjectivity statement, but a transparency statement. So like, let us know, you know, an article that came out in 2019 from Goen and colleagues, one of the recommendations was that like, hey, when you do research with people with autism, like you need to be super transparent and upfront about who you are, why you want to do autism research, and what your goals are. And so if we can just put those little statements in our papers, I think it'll kind of increase access for everybody and more trust among everybody. And so there we have it. That is it.
All right.
All of our references are here too if you want to be able to see them. But
Great. Thank you very much, Jess and Brian. No shortage of comments and questions for sure in the chat. We'll try to accommodate as many of these as possible. In the remaining time, I'll kind of pull out the ones that I noticed in chronological order of being added to the chat. And I believe these have yet to be addressed yet. So Beth is wondering, I'm trying to recall the timing of the study. Were you able to consider the Autism Self-Advocacy Network white paper on college success during the time of writing this?
so the study went out, we conducted the search in the spring of 2020, and we wrote up the paper, like, I'd say the summer of 2020. Would you say, Brian? Because it was rejected once, but hey, it's his research. So I would have to go back and look at my references, Beth. It's highly, highly likely that we did pull and like use citations from the white paper. I don't see why we wouldn't have, but I can't recall a specific spot in the paper. Can you, Brian?
No, I don't recall when that came out, but I don't think we referenced it.
Okay, okay.
And if for folks who, because I know many of you are looking at publishing or are publishing, so just, we don't mind being open about it. So it was JAD that rejected it, but just sort of like sight unseen, it seemed like.
It was a desk reject, yeah.
Right, we thought about submitting it to Autism, and instead JAD recommended our JAD. It's basically their review journal. And so we thought, in the interest of just getting this out there, we'd go that route.
But we are revising it right now, and one of the things that the reviewer said is that we keep using the same citation too much to say why we need to be including autistic voices. I latched onto a paper that was written in 2018 that I really liked, and I kept using it. So I will go back and we'll look at it and make sure that it's included in the revision.
Yeah, and thank you. Some of your suggestions too. The one on the comment on social skill interventions, I think will also be really cool. Or maybe that was the one that, oh no, I think that's the one that we actually, the Botema Butyl article.
Yes, yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Right.
Another question to throw out is from Yasmin. This research is so useful. Do you have any ideas of how to effectively teach things like authenticity in social interactions? Good question.
It's so good, right? I think one of the things that I want to dig more into as I get more comfortable with all of this is different bodies of literature that are not related to special education and disability specifically, like looking at language processes and relational processes and understanding how like language works. Right? There's an entire field that studies this, but it's kind of disconnected from disability and special education. So I think we need to dig more into those kinds of things. But also I think a huge, huge component of this would be making sure that people feel comfortable around the people that they're trying to interact with, right? So if we're talking about social relationships and friendships, like different from work, but if you're just talking about like, I'm lonely and I want to hang out with somebody and feel fulfilled, like, cool, let's find you, quote unquote, your people. Like I always used to tell my high schoolers, like, listen, your people are out there. Wait until you get to college. It's easier to find them than when you're in high school. But just people who kind of, you know, I have a very specific set of friends because I have quirks about my personality that like lots of people can't handle. So I think it's twofold. I think it's figuring out how to do it related to like actual language processes, and then also making sure that people are comfortable with the friends that they're trying to make and not fitting into something that's uncomfortable.
Very good points. Scott is asking, how are you defining, quote unquote, the autistic community and the autistic person's perspective? And then recognizing that there are sometimes differences in that terminology. So if you can explain that further.
Yeah, and I think, Scott, one of the things that we were really intentional about with our search is that we did not include co-occurring intellectual disability, mostly because, and this is something that comes up with us all of the time, especially because a lot of Brian's work is around people with IDD with more significant support needs. And so he's always like, well, wait a minute, which is completely valid and important to consider. And I think the reason that we did the study the way we did is because we wanted to look at that college population specifically, because we did the lit review because we were running social skills groups and we wanted to learn more about like what was out there and how to do it better. And so one thing that I recognize that I didn't mention in the paper, and I'm thrilled that we're doing this talk before it gets published, because that's one thing I'm going to put into our limitations, is that we really did have a narrow scope for people who have less support needs, and that there needs to be more that is looked at and kind of processed and thought through how to kind of support other people with autism through the social skills world. That's a great, great point.
This also came up in the review of the paper as well, which is the comment around parent involvement in assessing outcomes. And it was kind of an interesting comment, given that we were specific about the fact that we did not include studies that had individuals with intellectual disabilities. That said, you know, I think that there is, I think there's two important messages, and I'm really glad that this was brought up. One is that even if someone has an intellectual disability, that still doesn't mean that they shouldn't have some sort of input or feedback on the kinds of interventions that they're participating in, especially when they're adults. There should be a say in that, and they should be individualized according to what sorts of outcomes that person is looking for. In some cases, family members or other caregivers will also play an important role in helping to identify whether or not the kind of change is happening, in part because they'll also know that person and may be able to also understand what that person is trying to communicate. So family members and caregivers would continue to play an important role.
And I'm just going back to the chat, but Kristen, the study that you put in there is the one that I mentioned that I really, really connected with and kept coming back to in my citations, and they were like, can you cite something else? It's such a powerful paper. I loved that paper.
Yeah, it seems like there's some additional resources mentioned in the chat. Nikki mentioned, haven't read this book yet, but written by an autistic individual who explores neurotypical social norms. So definitely some things for folks to check out. I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment in the chat. I believe I covered what I saw that were explicit questions, but I want to encourage folks, we probably have time for one, maybe two questions if they're addressed very concisely. Or comments.
Wait, I just want to say that I just want to acknowledge Caden's comment about transparency statements and being hard if you're not ready to disclose, which we totally get, which is, you know, we get it. Which is why we're just putting it out there as a recommendation. Maybe if we can normalize it a little bit more, people might be more comfortable doing it, but it's hard. I get it.
I was just going to say, Caden, that almost seems like a research article in itself, just studying in terms of level of disclosure and transparency among autistic researchers. So I might be onto something.
Yeah. Lindsay looks like she asked if we have a social skills component. So we do. We went through the peers training and we implemented it for 2 semesters. And I don't do the programmatic side of things. I just do research. And then I did this lit review and I presented it to the team, and we've paused peers. And they are spending the semester and summer adapting it so that we can still provide some form of social support that is more aligned with what our students are asking us for. We also have a peer mentoring program that is more just kind of like connecting with other people on campus and socializing that way. And then if students want more specific social support, it's through their coach. And so they'll kind of identify what they need in terms of social support, and then the coach will kind of help them navigate that. Thank you for posting that, Beth.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. Okay, I think that covers it. I guess if folks want to hang on any longer to address any questions after the call formally concludes, I'm sure that could be handled. Definitely want to send our thanks and regards again to Jess and Brian. As always, really interesting stuff. And it seems like now there's like 40 something people on this call who could give feedback on on how to further enhance your paper as it's in this final stage. So
it's amazing timing. It was great.
Very fortunate.
Yes.
For sure. Before folks perhaps head out, just want to also recognize that our next Canvas meeting is scheduled for Thursday, May 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So you may recall that originally we had Haijung Kim from Binghamton, unfortunately, have to reschedule that particular talk, but we're really glad to have Dr. T.C. Weisman from the Autism Training Academy step in, and TC is always very wonderful and is going to talk about some of her dissertation work as that recently wrapped up. And soon enough, we're going to be assembling our schedule for July and beyond. So definitely going to have a more formal call of sorts. If you would like to present as part of Canvas, to reach out to me or us at CAN, and we can try to figure out how to bring you into that space. But in the meantime, we welcome you to continue to be part of our community, engage in the listserv. We'll have a link to the video and resources stemming from Jess and Brian's remarks today following the presentation. But yeah, thank you again. And if anybody wants to hang on the call to ask some remaining questions, you're welcome to do so.
Just going to sit here for a minute, Brett, until I see most people have cleared out.